Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, and spiritual growth. I'm Joy L, and each week we explore conscious development, awareness, and the deeper side of spiritual experience. So wherever you are, settle in and let's begin. There are moments in life when something starts to feel different, and you can't quite explain what it is. It's not that something big happened. It's not that your life suddenly changed overnight. It's more subtle than that. It's like you start noticing things you used to walk right past. You start noticing repetition. You start noticing timing. You start noticing meaning, where before there was just noise. And at first, you try to ignore it. You tell yourself, it's nothing. You say, it's just coincidence. You say, my mind is just making patterns, and you move on. But then it happens again, and again, and again. And eventually, you reach a point where you pause for half a second longer than usual and think, okay, that was weird. Not in a fearful way, just curious. And that curiosity, that tiny moment of curiosity, is actually where everything begins. Because once you start noticing pattern, you cannot unnotice it. Before we even talk about signs or synchronicities, we need to slow down and talk about what perception actually is. Because most people think they are seeing reality directly, but you are not. You are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing reality as it is filtered through attention, filtered through memory, filtered through emotion, filtered through what your nervous system decides is important. And that filtering is happening constantly, right now. Even as you listen to this, your brain is taking in thousands of pieces of information, sound, sensation, thought, memory, environment, and it is selecting only a tiny fraction of it to bring into awareness. Everything else gets pushed into the background, not because it doesn't exist, but because it is not relevant to your current focus. So already you are not experiencing everything. You are experiencing a selection, and that selection is based on pattern. Now here is where things start to feel interesting. Because sometimes something changes in your internal state. Maybe you are going through something emotional. Maybe you are questioning something in your life. Maybe you are uncertain. Maybe you are in transition. Maybe you are just more open than usual. And suddenly, your attention changes. Not dramatically, but enough that your filter starts catching different things. You start noticing repetition. You start noticing meaning. You start noticing emotional charge in places you didn't before. And this is where people begin saying things like, everything feels like a sign lately. But what is actually happening is not that reality changed. It is that your awareness became more sensitive to pattern, and pattern is always there, always. But now you are noticing it. Let's talk about signs. Let's talk about signs slowly, because this word gets misunderstood a lot. People think a sign is something sent to them, like The universe is sending messages in coded form, but that idea creates confusion because then people start asking, is this a real sign? Or am I just imagining it? And that question creates anxiety. So let's simplify it. A sign is not an external object with fixed meaning. A sign is something that becomes meaningful through repetition and emotional connection. Let me say that again more slowly. A sign is something that becomes meaningful because your awareness keeps encountering it at emotionally relevant moments. That is it. That is the mechanism. So a feather is not a sign universally. A number sequence is not a sign universally. A song is not a sign universally. It becomes a sign when your awareness repeatedly links it to emotional or psychological moments in your life. So really, a sign is not something given. A sign is something recognized, and recognition is internal. Now we go a little deeper because synchronicity feels different than a simple sign. Synchronicity is not just repetition. It is timing alignment. It is when something happening inside you and something happening outside you appear to match in a way that feels precise. And when that happens, it creates a feeling of this is not random. But again, we need to slow down here because your brain is constantly looking for connections. That is what it does. It connects information. It tries to complete patterns. It tries to make sense of timing. So when you are thinking about something emotionally important, your attention becomes highly tuned to anything related to it. And suddenly, you start noticing things you would normally ignore. And because they are happening close in time, your mind links them, not because they were necessarily caused by each other, but because they share emotional context. And emotional context is powerful. It makes unrelated events feel connected. Now, here's the deeper question. Why does this feel like something is communicating with you? Why does it feel intentional? Why does it feel directed? There are a few layers to this. First, human beings are wired to detect intention. If something feels patterned, your mind assumes intention behind it. Second, emotion intensifies meaning. So when something happens at a meaningful, emotional moment, it feels significant. Third, your awareness is always trying to create coherence. It does not like randomness. So when patterns align, your system interprets that as meaning, and meaning feels like communication. But communication does not always require a separate communicator. Sometimes communication is simply coherence being experienced consciously. Let's slow this down with an example. Imagine someone is thinking about changing their life direction. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet internal question. Is this still right for me? And they sit with that question for days. And then slowly, things start appearing. Not all at once, just gradually. They hear someone talking about change. They see a post about starting over. They overhear a conversation about leaving something behind. They hear a song that reminds them of endings. And each moment alone means nothing. But the mind doesn't experience them alone. The mind experiences them as a sequence. And sequences create pattern. And pattern creates meaning. And meaning creates the feeling of guidance. But what is actually happening is not external instruction. It is internal reflection. The outside world is mirroring the inside state. Now let's go even slower here, because this part matters. When you are emotionally activated, your attention changes. You begin scanning differently. You begin noticing differently. You begin remembering differently. Your nervous system prioritizes emotional relevance over neutrality. So anything connected to your emotional state becomes more visible. And this is why synchronicity increases during confusion, grief, transition, awakening, uncertainty, decision-making periods. Not because more is happening, but because more is being noticed, and what is being noticed has always been there. Let's pause here because this is important. Not every pattern is guidance. Not every coincidence is direction. Not every emotional reaction is intuition. Some of it is simply your brain doing what it does, connecting, interpreting, and organizing experience. But here's the subtle truth. Even if your mind is participating in meaning making, the experience of meaning is still real. And meaning is what shapes your perception of reality. So the goal is not to reject signs and not to overdepend on them either. The goal is to learn how to relate to them without distortion. Let's slow everything down for a moment. Just allow your attention to settle. You do not need to change anything, just notice. Bring your awareness to something you are currently uncertain about, a question, a decision, a feeling. And instead of asking, what is the answer? Ask something softer. Ask, what keeps repeating around this? And then just wait. Not for words, not for a message. Just notice what arises. A memory, a feeling, a subtle image, a sense of direction. And then let it pass. Because intuition is not always a message. Sometimes it is simply a shift in what you are noticing. In the next part, we are going to go deeper into how synchronicities actually build over time, how people misinterpret meaning when they are emotionally activated, and how to develop trust in your perception without becoming dependent on signs. And we will bring everything back into grounding, so you are not chasing meaning, but learning how to live in awareness of it. So now we go deeper, because in the first part, we laid the foundation. We talked about perception. We talked about pattern. We talked about signs and synchronicities as something you are noticing, not necessarily something being sent to you in the way people often imagine. But now we move into something more subtle, more layered, more experiential, because once you start noticing pattern, the next question always becomes, okay, but what is it actually doing? Is this just my mind? Is there something more intelligent happening here? And this is where people either overreach or shut down completely. So in this part, we're going to stay right in the middle, grounded, clear, no extremes, just observation. One of the biggest misunderstandings about synchronicity is that people think it happens as a single event, a moment, a coincidence, a flash of timing. But synchronicity is rarely one moment. It is usually a sequence, a thread, a pattern unfolding over time. Let's slow that down because this matters. You think about something once, nothing happens. You think about it again, still nothing. But your attention has now touched the theme. And once attention touches a theme, your awareness begins tracking it in the background. You might not realize it yet, but something has shifted. And then over the next days, you start noticing related things. Not because they weren't there before, but because your attention has become tuned to that frequency of meaning. And this is where synchronicity actually begins. Not at the event, but at the shift in attention. At a certain point, people begin to feel like, this is happening directly for me. And we need to be very careful here because there are two ways this feeling can be interpreted. One is inflated. The other is grounded. Inflated interpretation says, the universe is sending me specific messages constantly. Grounded interpretation says, my awareness is becoming highly sensitive to pattern and meaning. And both can feel identical in experience. So the difference is not in the feeling. The difference is in how we relate to the feeling. Because when awareness becomes sensitive, everything starts to feel personal. Not because everything is directed at you, but because everything is being filtered through your emotional significance. And emotional significance is powerful. It makes neutral events feel meaningful. It makes ordinary timing feel intentional. It makes repetition feel like communication. Now, let's talk about something people often hesitate around: spirit communication. And we're going to slow this way down and keep it very grounded because most confusion comes from over-defining it. Spirit communication is not always voices. It is not always visions. It is not always symbolic drama. Most of the time, it is subtle alignment. Subtle alignment of awareness and pattern recognition. Let me say that more simply. Spirit communication is the experience of meaning emerging through timing, resonance, and internal clarity. It often feels like a thought arriving softly, a feeling of knowing without evidence, a repeated theme showing up externally, a conversation mirroring your internal state, a dream that echoes your emotional process. But none of these things are proof by themselves. They are signals within a larger system of perception. And the key here is they always require interpretation. And interpretation is internal, not external. Now we go deeper into psychology, because something very important is happening when people go through awakening-like experiences. Your brain is not becoming more magical. It is becoming more attentive. Attention changes everything because attention determines what becomes conscious. And when attention becomes more sensitive, it begins detecting repetition, timing, emotional resonance, symbolic overlap. And once those are detected, your mind begins building connections between them, not consciously at first, subconsciously. And then suddenly you feel like everything is connected. But what is actually happening, your brain is increasing associative linking between experiences. This is not delusion. This is recognition. This is how humans make meaning. The difference is intensity. Let's slow this down into a real-life type of experience. Imagine someone is in a transition period. They are not sure about their direction, nothing dramatic, just inner questioning. They begin thinking, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. And then they leave it alone. But the question doesn't disappear. It stays in the background. Your awareness begins scanning reality differently, not intentionally, automatically. Then over the next days, they notice small things. A friend talks about change. A video appears about starting over. Someone mentions trust. A random conversation touches uncertainty. A memory surfaces from years ago about beginnings and endings. And none of these moments are connected externally, but internally, they feel connected because they share emotional tone. An emotional tone is what binds experience together. So the person begins to feel like, this is pointing me somewhere. But what is actually happening is that their internal question is shaping what they notice externally. And this is the core mechanism of synchronicity, not external instruction. Internal resonance reflected outward. Now we need to slow down and ground this, because this is where people can overinterpret. When everything starts feeling meaningful, the mind can start assigning direction to everything. And that is where confusion begins. Because meaning is not the same as instruction. Just because something feels significant does not mean it is telling you what to do. Sometimes it is simply reflecting your internal state back to you. And the most important skill in this entire process is discernment, not denial, not obsession. Discernment, the ability to notice without over-assigning certainty, to see pattern without forcing conclusion, to feel meaning without demanding direction. So how do you distinguish grounded intuition from emotional projection? We slow it down. True clarity tends to feel quiet, simple, stable, non-urgent. Even if it is surprising, it does not destabilize you. It does not rush you. It does not create spiraling interpretation loops. It often feels like, oh, that makes sense, even if you cannot explain why. False signals tend to feel urgent, anxious, repetitive in the mind, emotionally charged, mentally sticky. They pull you into thinking. True clarity pulls you into stillness. Now, here is a subtle but important point. Why does all of this feel external? Why does it feel like something is communicating with you from outside your mind? There is a simple reason. Because your mind experiences itself through contrast. You experience thoughts as inside. You experience environment as outside. So when internal states and external events align, it creates a sense of interaction. But that interaction is happening within one continuous field of awareness. The separation is useful, but it is also conceptual. And synchronicity is what happens when that separation feels temporarily transparent. So let's slow everything down again. No searching, no forcing meaning, just noticing. Bring your attention to something unresolved in your life right now. Not to solve it, just to hold it lightly. And now ask, what keeps showing up around this? not as a demand, just as curiosity. And notice, not the answer, but the pattern of what comes to mind. Maybe it is a feeling. Maybe it is a memory. Maybe it is a repeated theme. And then release it, because insight is not always immediate. Sometimes it arrives through accumulation, through repetition, through noticing. So as we close this episode, what I want to leave you with is very simple. Signs are not separate from you. Synchronicities are not separate from you. And meaning is not something you chase. It is something that emerges when awareness becomes still enough to notice pattern. And you do not need to force it. You do not need to overinterpret it. You do not need to turn every moment into instruction. Instead, you begin to trust something quieter. Your own ability to notice. Your own ability to sense resonance. Your own ability to pause long enough to see pattern forming. And that is where clarity lives. Not in intensity, but in awareness. And so you don't need to chase signs. You only need to learn how to see what is already happening. And from there, everything begins to speak differently. Not louder, just clearer. Thank you for being here with me today. If this resonated with you, you can continue your development through Alpha Mediumship Academy using the link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And just remember, you're probably perceiving more clearly than you think. You're just learning how to trust it. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and trust yourself a little more than you did yesterday.